And we're back. We have a fabulous panel for you. So answering the question, who owns data, international governance in a complex ecosystem, we have Wendell Wallach, Senior Advisor from the Hastings Center and Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, Yale University. Anja Kaspersen, former head of Geopolitics and International Security at World Economic Forum. Professor Dame Wendy Hall, Regius Professor of Computer Science, Director Web Science, University of Southampton. And our moderator today is Alecsandru, International Security Program for Chatham House. Over to you, Anna. Thanks.
Thank you, Amelia. Good afternoon, and welcome to the World Summit AI panel on international governance in a complex system. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today to discuss a topic ripe for cross-sector and cross-border collaboration. Artificial intelligence can impact society in countless ways, and we really need to think long-term about the steps we should take to develop international mechanisms for the global governance of international intelligence. My name is Alecsandru, and I'm a researcher in the International Security Program at Chatham House in London, and I'm honored to introduce very, very briefly our three excellent panelists, just mention a few other things that are key for the discussion today. Wendell Wallach, he is also the lead organizer of the first International Congress on the Governance of AI, project which I hope he will tell us more about shortly. Anja is a strategy professional, geopolitics and international security expert and practitioner. And Professor Dame Wendy Hall is one of the world's leading computer scientists and plays a leading role in shaping science and engineering policy and education, both in the UK and internationally. And Dame Wendy co-chaired the UK government's AI review, published in 2017, and is a member of the AI Council, an independent expert committee providing advice to government and high-level leadership of the AI ecosystem in the UK. And in May 2020, she was appointed chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute. So the format of our session is the following. Each speaker will have roughly 5 minutes to share their initial thoughts on the topic, after which we'll have a discussion and expand on some of the issues that come up. Wendell, welcome. Could you please tell us more about your current work, and in particular, what is the first International Congress on the Governance of AI? What is the goal? What is trying to achieve? And please correct me if I'm wrong, the event will take place in May next year?
Hopefully. We're all dealing with this COVID-19 crisis, and that event is likely to be much more effective if it can be an in-person event. So we're still gauging whether it will convene or not. It's grown out of the insight that there's a total mismatch between existing forms of governance and the speed of scientific discovery and technological innovation. Our existing forms of governance are just not capable of keeping up with that. We have what's sometimes referred to as a pacing problem. Technologies get entrenched in the fabric of daily life long before we can put in place ethical legal oversight. So the International Congress is an opportunity to take first steps toward putting in place 21st century governance. Now, when we talk about the needs for reform and governance, we're often talking about the need for agility and adaptivity, for true multi-stakeholder gatherings. There are certainly attempts to do so with the OECD, with the UN, with other international bodies now. But my own evaluation is none of them is totally inclusive or meaningfully inclusive as far as underrepresented communities, indigenous populations, small nations, and perhaps more importantly, that most of them don't really have a significant role for China. So I don't know how we can even be talking about international governance unless we have China at the table. So that is what we are making an effort to do with the International Congress for the Governance of AI. Hopefully the COVID-19 crisis will abate enough that we will be able to move forward with that. But in the meantime, we're in this very difficult situation where the digital AI oligopoly is getting ever more powerful. The COVID crisis has actually exacerbated that trend while we are actually hamstrung as far as trying to put in any form of effective governance, any form of effective ethical legal oversight. So that's it for my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Wendell. Anja, moving on to you. So you collaborate with Wendell on a project on AI and structural inequality, and we'd love to learn more about this work. So how can the AI systems be governed globally, regionally, and locally without exacerbating existing structural inequalities?
So thank you so much, Anna. And I think if I had a straight answer to that, I'd probably be up for some award just about now. So I will try to, to bring some perspectives to your question. But let me just first, I'm always honored to be speaking together with Wendell and also Wendy. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Sarah, Claire, and Vidya, and the whole FAB team at Inspired Minds that for years now keep inspiring all of us, including bringing us together for discussions like this. So let me share, I mean, your question is, sounds as it is very targeted and there's an easy answer to it, but obviously there's not. And Wendell touched on a couple of those points. Let me just if I give you just kind of a couple of headliners and then hopefully we can dive into them as we proceed, and I'm mindful of my 5 minutes as well. If I give you, so first of all, there's the issue around the governance of data, which is also features in the title of this discussion. And I think it's important to remember, that data, the value of data is 60% of the current global GDP. And the estimate currently is that it's growing 2.5 times, acceleration of growth 2.5 times faster than any other part of the GDP kind of measurements. Now, you don't have to be a geopolitical expert, and I know this is your expertise, Anna, to then understand that how we govern data, how we manage data, how we use and deploy data is going to be a key element to both understanding and managing any kind of geopolitical, geostrategic skirmishes, differences, hedging strategies, etc. going forward. That's my first point. Second point relates to what Wendell was saying around, the purpose of the global meeting that he's organizing, which has to do with bringing different domains and disciplines together. One of the issues that I've been dealing a lot with in my job is that we are still so many tribes, with our different vernacular, our different nomenclature, our different ways of discussing this issue. Even trying to have a clear understanding of what data is, you have to understand to what purpose, how it's going to be used, where, how, the whole life cycle of a data flow, to even understand how to address it. And the vernacular and the tribes involved tends to change, with that. And also that's important to understand where are the vulnerabilities in the life cycle of data. So I hope we can come back to that, given that that's sort of the main focus of this discussion. Then there's a third point on data cyber. And with COVID, and I will come back to it, how COVID and the pandemic situation has accelerated a lot of the trends that are deeply impacted on both the geopolitics and also how we think around data and how we think around AI. And although there are, a lot of writings being done right now about how there are more cyber attacks, they're becoming more sophisticated. The truth is that there also are, the attack surfaces are becoming larger because we're all coming online. If there's one thing this crisis have shown us is that not only how important our critical infrastructure is, how our connectivity is part of essential services, part of our essential services, yet not governed it that way, and how the attack surfaces are growing by the day and the way it's being used. So just one small kind of example, which I think is important to this discussion, is that Satya Nadella, who's the president or the CEO of Microsoft, some months back, I think it was around April, he published an article where he said that, and I quote him directly, 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. That's what they were seeing from the view of Microsoft, what COVID was doing with our internet behavior and our online behavior. Now, you do the math, and we're now 10 months into it. That speaks of a 10-year acceleration of digital transformation. But we have not invested in the safety systems, the safeguarding of our data, and most importantly of all, the skill sets and the maturity of people to manage and govern their online presences and their digital avatars that Nout was that one of the previous panels were speaking of. And this is, of course, important to the previous session on decision making and how these discrete decision points, become part of our reality. Do we have the maturity to manage that reality in the best possible way? Then there's the fifth point, which is on outlook. Where you're sitting in all of this, the more complex your situation is. If you're in a crisis situation, you're coming out of war, you're in a humanitarian crisis, how your data is being used, how it's collected, how it's curated, who's using it, has very significantly different impact, to a situation. For example, I'm in Norway, and for someone who is fleeing an oppressive regime, is find themselves in a refugee camp where essentially they have to exchange their data with essential services and then sometimes even food, and how that data can be used. And Timnit was speaking a lot about how data can be misused and trail you and create a digital trail that will impact on your future. And this is particularly important when we speak about how data is being used or deployed in a more vulnerable setting. And then my last point, which is a very important point, and I know this is something Wendell has been looking at as well, is the data health conundrum. How COVID has essentially made our biodata, our bodies, the new currency. And World Summit AI has been focusing a lot on how AI will fundamentally transform healthcare, which is very important. And I think there's a lot of value in all of this, and especially considering, and I saw a recent estimate that by 2030, we will even have a global shortfall of about 18 million health workers around the world. There's a lot of benefits in looking at ways of using technology differently in health. But there's also a discussion that is yet to be had and is not being had in appropriate manners yet, which is how health data will fundamentally transform AI. And I think this issue around how you are now combining the convergence between behavioral data and our very personal genomic data is a very important one. And this goes to my career more in the national security domain, that how we can weaponize the genomic data, how we can manipulate our genomic data and our biodata is a very, very important topic. And it may seem obvious to people, but how this all will play into the national security, international security domain will be very important in years to come. And I look forward to dive into some of these issues in the course of our discussion. So over to you, Anja.
Thank you so much, Anja. I mean, you've covered so many important points that we probably need an entire conference to expand on all of those topics. But we can try in the next 15 minutes. Dame, last but not least, Dame Wendy, you have been involved in so many initiatives concerning the governance of AI. Perhaps you could expand on the developments in UK policy on AI, and from your experience with this, discuss some of the challenges and opportunities for the global governance of AI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anja, and it's lovely to be on a panel with Wendell and Anja. To be honest. So you asked us about who owns the data. That was our question to answer. And I mean, I think the one of the short answers is not us, right? I think, and actually, when people talk about personal data, there's actually very little personal data. In fact, our genome is most of the personal data we have. All the data that is about us is created mostly by other people, whether it's our government or the retail stores we have loyalty cards with, or the datagopolis in Silicon Valley. It's all transactional in a sense, and at the moment we own very little of data that is about us. We might share it with other people, but I shouldn't dwell on that too much. When Jerome Pesenti and I wrote the AI review for the UK government, I don't think any of us. AI today, I must say this, is about machine learning, deep learning, training algorithms on huge amounts of data. So although we all thought the issues were going to be about developing the algorithms and accountability of algorithms and transparency of algorithms, actually it's as much about, if not more about, the governance of the data. because that is far more complicated. The algorithms, computer scientists can sort of get your head around how you do things like this, and we throw more science at it, more development at it, to try and understand explainable AI and how you make an algorithm auditable. But the data is much more complicated because it's all about, it's not just about us as citizens, it's about our governments and how they regulate and the different cultures we live in, and about industry and how they deal with the data and what they are trying to do what they are. Their main aim is to make money. And, that's just a very, very complicated environment. And in the AI review, Jerome and I were quite prescient about this because we put the issue of data sharing as the number one recommendation the UK should focus on, as well as skills and all the other things that we needed to put in a national strategy. We insisted on that. Other people didn't realise why, but you can see now why we did. And in fact, I don't think we have. I agree with Wendell. I don't think we have done enough on this. I think Anja said we're all saying the same thing. The technology is moving forward, and COVID has accelerated a lot of that, but the governance frameworks have not, and they're incredibly complicated, and you have to think of it on a global level. You can have a national policy or a regional policy, but you have to think about it on a global level. And I'm going to, because we're running out of time, I'm going to cut short what I was going to say, but I totally agree with Wendell that you can't talk about this stuff without including the 20% of the people that live in China, or if it's 20% of the world population that live in China, or it's probably bigger than that because of the influence China has on other parts of the world, like Africa and other parts of Southeast Asia. We cannot exist in a bubble where we think about it from a point of view of what's happening in the US or what's happening in Europe in terms of GDPR and the regulation that Europe's going to come out with, because if we're going to trade and we're going to deal with data and AI with China, then they have a different system. But there are ethical issues that we can agree on. So I think we have to talk about at the international table, what are the things that we do agree on, and where do we differ, and how do we deal with that, rather than just saying, well, we'll do all this without considering China. And I've been writing about this in my book with my colleague Kieran O'Hara in the geopolitical fragmentation of the internet, because data governance underlies how the internet works. And I think these are really, really major issues, and I very much hope I'll be able to go to Wendell's conference. And I'm putting my passion in the UK into helping people develop legal and ethical frameworks under which to share data. And I'm writing a report at the moment with the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Royal Society and the London Law Society about legal mechanisms for data stewardship, thinking of it in a UK context, and then we'll look at that in an international scene to just what are the different mechanisms under which you can share data, either to make money or to solve a pandemic or anything in between.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So, as you all pointed out, data is the new currency, and there's the old saying, if you're not paying for the product, then by default you are the product. So you've all touched upon this, and inevitably progress on the international governance of AI has been impacted by the pandemic. But do we have any opportunities here? What can we do at the moment? What should be the next steps? And in your opinion, do we have any hope given all the challenges we have in the world at the moment with this pandemic? Anyone wants to start?
Well, I'll kick off. I thought Wendell might pick up on this because he hasn't said anything for a while. But in the UK, we're very much. In fact, I just did this morning a select committee for the House of Lords, our House of Lords, who published a very influential report on AI and ethics 2 years ago now. They were looking at where the UK's got on this, and one of the key things that we need to do more on is this issue of data trust. And I think also we're talking about ethics in AI, which is this is very a lot. This whole governance of AI and data is an ethical issue at one level, legal and ethical issue. And we can talk forever. I mean, philosophers can talk forever about ethics, and it's really interesting. But actually, we need to get on with some very practical stuff, and that's what we were talking about this morning in terms of how do we develop simple and practical audit mechanisms for companies, large and small, that are usable and move us in the right direction. So you need a government system like we do with financial regulation that says companies have to do this, and then make it easy enough for them to do in current circumstances, and evolve that over time as we consider and understand more about the issue. So I was urging this morning our government to think in very practical steps at the moment, whilst the big national and international discussions go on.
The good news out there is that the scientists, and hopefully now the governments, are starting to understand that there is a challenge there. So unlike past generations of scientists who used to slough off the ethical challenges implicit in the technologies they were introducing and say, well, that's not our problem, that's the politicians' problem. Today we actually have a generation of scientists that is focusing on AI safety, though I think some of them are a little over-obsessed with the futuristic problems associated with artificial and general intelligence, and not necessarily all looking as seriously at the issues around transparency and bias and privacy. But the good news, as Wendy has just said, is yes, there is a lot of work on that front. There's beginning to be some government funding to further that work. And even the corporations sort of get it, or at least they are giving lip service to AI ethics. Whether this is ethics washing and we have to hold their feet to the fire, or whether they will really take some of the necessary measures to ensure the ethical deployment and use the ethical deployment of algorithms and the ethical use of data, that's yet to be revealed. And the other good news, I've, for example, been going back and forth to China and talking in Africa and India, and it's clear that AI ethics is getting a foothold in all of these domains. Again, whether it will be ethics washing or whether it will actually be a serious commitment to address these problems, that's yet to be revealed.
If I may jump in there from my end. So, it's an interesting, I've been involved in the World Summit, since the outset, and I've also seen how the conversation in the context of the World Summit and the business participants, etc., engaging in the discussion. And we sort of, I find that in industry, there's a greater awareness of the limitations now of these technologies that we're talking about. So there's a different kind of discussion than you find in more the government cycles. So I agree with both Wendy and Wendell, that there is an increased cooperation between scientists. There's an increased dialogue between technologists. I still think we have some way to go to see the same level of, if I may call it, fluency in the technology, AI, vernacular, and understanding in the government side of things. So that's one thing that concerns me, and also one thing where I think is an opportunity we need to invest more in. I have seen one terminology which is being used, and this goes to Wendell's point about these different ethical frameworks. And I listened to you this morning, Wendy, when you were one of the witnesses, in the discussion you just mentioned, and you were actually saying, and a couple of other people on the call was speaking about the trust in the technology and the trust in the system that the technology is enabling or being embedded into. And that is very important to distinguish between these two trust paradigms, because they require very different type of governance and a different discussion about who owns the data and who owns the right to make decision, both to embed that data and also how you curate and how you collect that data. And that brings me to a very important point, which is the issue of interoperability. And this is a terminology from, as a national security person, means something very specific when you talk about this in a military context. But I find that it's a term that is also quite helpful when you speak about data. And we see this very clearly with COVID-19 now. We're speaking about these various tracing apps. There's a lot to be said about, the bioinformatics side of it, the safety side of it. Are we entering into new biosurveillance society? Is it a surveillance capitalism society? There's lots of discussions going on in this area, but I think until such time that we actually start having a greater sense of interoperability between these ethical framings or efforts of, having an ethical discussions around these issues, we're also not really going to be able to advance. We're just going to have a more philosophical discussion. We may not get to the regulatory side, but we need to start having a discussion about how these frameworks, even aspirational, somehow fit together. And that's, of course, the important work that Wendell has been doing, and Wendy as well.
Thank you so much, Anja. If I could just ask you to move a bit closer to the microphone next time you speak, so we can all hear you well. So we have this nexus between the cybersecurity and data, and the issue of trust that Anja has just highlighted. So how do we move forward, given that we have so many stakeholders that have various interests? What's the best forum to discuss all this? All the challenges that we have on trust at all the possible levels, as you've just mentioned, Anja. So if you would like to expand on this, or the other two panelists have more to add on this issue of building trust and transparency.
I think there's no one answer to your question, Anna. We have to move forward on several fronts. And international agreement is, as you know, with things like climate change, incredibly difficult to get real agreement on, but it does give you a platform for the discussions. Whereas nationally, we can lobby our governments to regulate where regulation needs to happen fast. I use the example of face recognition here, where we can see the creeping use of it throughout our Europe and the US, and there is no real regulation to deal with it. That covers, there are privacy, of course, regulations, but we had this discussion, I think, on the House of Lords Committee this morning. The regulations are not fit for purpose, and deep fakes as well. They terrify me. Whether it's text or video, where it's very difficult to technically work out that something is a fake or has been produced by an AI algorithm like GPT-3 or whatever. And so I think that we have to use carrot and stick here. And if people are caught doing things that are, using someone else's lying, or using someone else's identity or physical characteristics to disseminate information, then they should have the book thrown at them. But there are examples. I could go on, but we have to press on that. And then I also make the point, actually, that education is really important, because we talk about ethics all the time, and that's what these are the things that society does. And we look to our government to regulate. We think about it from a societal point of view, but there's also an issue of morals here, personal morals. Why do people think they can do things digitally that they would never do in the physical world? And I think there's some self-regulation here as well that we need to impress on people, particularly the young, as they move into this world. And so it's beholden on all of us to tackle this issue. By all of us, I mean all the different stakeholders. There is not one answer to your question.
Let me say very quickly, we do not have trust. We have a breakdown of trust in the modern world, and we are at an inflection point. We have what Jürgen Habermas would call a delegitimation crisis, where citizens have lost any faith in their government's ability to solve problems like this. And if we don't stop futzing around and not dealing with things like lethal autonomous weapons and climate change and other issues which are at the top of the heap, we will be so caught up in reacting to crises as we are now with COVID-19 that we will lose little agency in taking initiative to create a new and better world. So I could go on with that. There are a lot of drivers of trust. There are a lot of things that get into the way of trust. But I do know that this session is about to end, and I do want to give Anja a minute or two to finish up.
And yeah, you have 1-2 minutes. I mean, no trust. We have plenty of challenges. Any positive notes to end with?
I'm afraid I don't have any positive notes. I mean, I think all three of us, and I think I can speak on behalf of Wendy and Wendell. I mean, we generally, big believers in technology. We believe in science. We believe that these can really do good. We believe that if it's done and used in a right, deployed in a right way, it can indeed, counter inequality. I mean, it can lead to greater inequality. I think we just all worry that we are sleepwalking a little bit through some of the big hurdles and some of the fundamentals that need to be discussed to actually set us on the right path. I couldn't agree more with what Wendy was saying, that we really need to invest in people. If there's one thing we've seen in history, from whatever angle you come at it, is that when the right people have the right type of knowledge to deploy when you're interacting with technology or something that is beyond ourselves, that's the critical thing. And I don't think we're doing it. There's a great phrase called cyber poverty line. I'm borrowing that from an article that was written recently. And are we sufficiently investing in making sure that those that need to have the knowledge to manage the fact that we're becoming much more vulnerable as we're becoming connected? How do you get those trade-offs right? The investment in people, investment in safeguarding our systems at the same time as we're investing in people's connectivity and basically bringing on board a whole new type of online infrastructure, which goes to your cyber question, with our critical infrastructure has never been more connected before, and that creates a whole, set of discussions that needs to be had both at the multilateral level and at the individual and collective, also industry level. And, there's been a lot of talk lately about vaccine nationalism. Nationalism has gotten a bit of a revival in public discourse, data nationalism. I'm still a firm believer in multilateralism. And so I do think that there are still a lot of, there's a lot of value in trying to bring these discussions together as governments, but we may need to prepare ourselves from a slightly different type of discussions and where the solutions and the agreements might not be as wide ranging as in the past. And then try to rethink, what we, how we define multilateralism in the technology landscape. And then just a very, last point, there's a lot of convenience to all of this. And I see that there's a lot of government actors that really have to make some very tough, and I don't envy any of them their job, trade-offs on how to adopt and deploy these technologies. And this is exactly why, this public discourse is so important, and to bring this on board with a much greater deal of foresight and be willing to have some of the uncomfortable discussions. And I think that's where I see that we are struggling. How do we have uncomfortable discussions without slowing the system down?
Thanks, Anja. That's been like a great summary of on bringing back all the points that we've tried to cover. And I think now you will have a Q&A session, so you can actually expand and have another 30 minutes on other points. So thank you very much for this and for the presentations, and nice to see you all, and hope you're well wherever in the world you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you guys so much for such a great panel. Really appreciate it. I do a lot of work in between kind of tech and startups and then end user governments. And I really have seen a new trend in that tech companies do want some kind of governance and regulation. They want some kind of standards to be held to now, which has been kind of a change in the last few years. So it's really great to hear your strong voices echoing that. So thank you very much. If you have questions for our panel, please click the link in the chat box, and that will bring you over to their Q&A session. On the session stage right now, we have a panel on cultivating bold partnerships in the pandemic paradigm. Our moderator is Ramon Rahmanton. He's the co-founder of World Space Week. On the panel, we have Igor Bucher. He is of Trendwatcher, Malik Trebelski, Loeb, who is a futurist and lawyer, and then Hassan Al-Halou, who is a strategic advisor. Here on this stage, we are going to go right on to our next speaker, who has been active as a researcher, consultant, and entrepreneur in AI, machine learning, and data mining for over 25 years. He's a senior manager with a keen focus on the development of AI-enabled solutions and a member of Deloitte's AI Center of Excellence. He has extensive experience applying AI techniques in a variety of public and private sectors and was one of the founders of the data mining practice at Capgemini in the 1990s. Interesting. And was CTO of a successful AI startup. He's also an assistant professor at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And he holds a PhD in AI from that institute. Speaking today on The Age with Humans Working with AI, please welcome Everett Hastings.
Good afternoon.
Over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this lovely introduction. I am trying to share my screen, and I realize that we have a bit of a snag here, which is unfortunate. Let me just see what I can do to solve this. 1 second, please. Okay. For some reason, my system has reset my security preferences, which is very annoying. And I think I may have to re-log in. I'm very sorry.
No problem. We will just go to a quick break, and when you're back, we'll go straight to you. Just hold tight 1 minute, guys. Thanks.